Nevada. August 1879, three armed men ride into a small town looking for one person, a widow, alone, 33 years old. They find her sitting in a saloon, back to the wall, glass of rye, not running. The man who hired them wants her land, wants her gone. Already buried her husband 2 years ago to get it. She knows all of this. She knew it before they walked through the door. What they don't know, what nobody in that room knows yet, is that she's been preparing for this moment for 6 months. Every detail, every exit, every weakness in every man sitting across from her. One will choose the right side. One will go home to his children. One will not walk out. And when it's over, when the dust settles and the guns go quiet, she will ride alone into the dark toward the man who started all of it, not for revenge, for something harder than that. They say the most dangerous person in a room isn't the one looking for a fight. It's the one who already knows how it ends. Ada Morgan had known how most things ended for a long time now. She hadn't always. There was a version of her, younger, softer, quicker to laugh, who had believed that knowing how things ended was pessimism, that you should walk into a room and see possibility instead of exits. Thomas had cured her of that. Not on purpose, just by dying. When your husband gets shot and you spend 3 days making arrangements and signing papers and nodding, while men explain things to you in slow, careful voices, you learn something. You learn that the world doesn't adjust itself around what you believed before. It just keeps moving. And you either learn to move with it, or you stand still and get knocked down again. Ada Morgan had decided she was done getting knocked down. She sat at the corner table of Ruth's saloon in Red Rock, Nevada. Back to the wall. Always the wall. She'd started doing that after Thomas died and hadn't stopped. It wasn't fear exactly. It was just information. Sitting with your back to a wall meant you could see the whole room. You could see who came in and who went out. You could see where people looked and where they didn't. Most people didn't think about these things. Ada thought about all of them. The saloon smelled like sawdust and old whiskey, and something else she'd never been able to name exactly. Something that clung to places where people came to sit with their problems for a while. August in Nevada meant the air itself felt like something you had to push through. The flies had slowed down. The dog that usually barked somewhere behind the livery stable had gone quiet 20 minutes ago. Ada had a glass of rye in front of her, half full. She wasn't in a hurry with it. She was in Red Rock to buy seed grain. The supplier was loading it onto the Henderson wagon. Old man Henderson had offered to haul it out to her property since he was going that direction anyway. That was the kind of thing people did in small towns. Small kindnesses that required nothing in return, except that you remember to do the same when you could. Thomas had been good at that, better than her. She was trying to get better at it. While she waited, she watched the room. The young bartender, new, name she hadn't caught, kept cleaning a spot on the counter that was already clean. 2 men played cards in the middle of the room with the specific silence of people who had been playing together long enough that they didn't need to talk. A woman near the window was mending something, not looking up. Ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Ada had learned not to trust ordinary. She counted the boots she could hear on the boardwalk outside. She counted the horses at the hitching posts. 3 of them she didn't recognize. They'd come from the north side of town, which meant they hadn't come through Main Street, which meant they hadn't wanted to be noticed coming in. People who didn't want to be noticed were either shy or deliberate. In Ada's experience, shy people didn't ride in groups of 3. Ruth came out from behind the bar. Ruth was the woman who owned the place. Not a coincidence that they shared a name, just one of those small ironies that life in a small town produces. Ruth, the saloon owner, was 60 years old and had the face of someone who had decided around age 45 that she was done being surprised by human behavior. She'd seen enough of it. She'd filed it all away. She came toward Ada's table with a cloth in her hand, wiping things down, casual, the performance of casualness. She bent close to the table. 3 riders, she said, low, conversational, like she was commenting on the weather. Came in this morning from the Reno Road. Been asking around town about a woman named Ada Morgan. Ada set her glass down, slowly, carefully. What did they look like, she said. Trouble, Ruth said. The professional kind. Not the drunk kind. She straightened up, moved away without looking back behind the bar like nothing had happened. Ada sat with that for a moment. She'd known this was coming. Not today specifically, but coming ever since she'd shot Grant Crane 6 months ago. Ever since she'd stood in her own doorway with Thomas's rifle and made the only decision available to her at the time, and watched Grant Crane go down in her front yard with 2 witnesses standing 15 feet away. Grant had drawn first. That was in the report. The sheriff, Cal Denton, who had been patient and thorough and had written everything down exactly as it happened, had filed the paperwork himself, self-defense, clear and documented. Silas Crane did not care about paperwork. Silas Crane was 55 years old and owned more land in Mineral County than any other single person. He had built that through a combination of business sense, patience, and the specific willingness to use whatever tools were available to him. He was not, as far as Ada knew, a man who had ever personally raised a hand against anyone. He was, however, a man who knew people who would, and Grant had been his brother. Ada looked at the door. Okay, she thought. Not dramatic about it, just, okay, here we are. She thought about Claire, 7 years old now, back at the farm with the Hendersons' daughter watching her for the afternoon. Claire, who had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and had already decided at age 7 that she was going to have opinions about everything and share them freely. Ada breathed in slowly, breathed out. The door opened 3 men. The first one through set the tone for all of it, not because he was large or loud or threatening in any obvious way. He wasn't any of those things. He was medium height, medium build, wearing a dark coat that had seen a lot of territory and a lot of weather. He moved into the room the way water moves into a space, filling it evenly, finding the level, settling. His eyes moved across every person in the room in under 3 seconds. That was Beck Harrow. Ada knew the type before she knew the name. She'd grown up in a county where men like this passed through occasionally. Her father had pointed one out to her once when she was 12. "See how he holds himself," her father had said. "Not tense, not relaxed, just ready." That's the difference between someone who's learned their trade and someone who's still practicing it. She'd remembered that behind Harrow, 2 more. The young one had 22, maybe 23 years of age and about 40 years of confidence. He wore his gun like he was proud of the relationship. His chin was up a half-inch too high. His eyes moved around the room differently than Harrow's, not assessing, performing. Looking to see who was watching him arrive, Ada had seen this type too. Young men who had decided they were a certain kind of person and were waiting for the world to confirm it. They were predictable in a specific way, almost reassuring in their predictability. If you knew what to look for, the third man was harder to read. Older, heavier, not fat, just the weight of someone who had been carrying something for a long time. He walked behind the other 2 without the energy of someone who wanted to be there. His hand didn't hover near his gun. He was just present, ambulatory, going through the motions of something he'd done before and hadn't fully committed to this time. Harrow's eyes found her. She didn't look away. Most people in the room had already found reasons to look at other things. The card players were deeply interested in their cards. The bartender had found his spot again. The mending woman had become very absorbed in her mending. Ada looked at Harrow directly, because looking away told a person something. It told them you were afraid, or you were guilty, or you were hoping that if you didn't make eye contact, the situation would somehow resolve itself without involving you. Ada had learned that situations did not resolve themselves. You resolved them. Harrow crossed the room, unhurried. The walk of a man who had done this before and understood that how you arrived told the other person something. He pulled out the chair across from her, sat down. The young one, Rex, she'd learn, moved to her left. The tired one, Walt, stayed back, positioned near the wall without quite committing to blocking anything. Walt was the kind of person who positioned himself out of habit, rather than strategy at this point. Ada noted all of this in the time it took Harrow to settle into his chair. "Ada Morgan," Harrow said. "Not a question, depends on who's asking," she said. Old answer. He'd heard it before. His expression didn't move, Beck Harrow. Out of Reno, he put his hands on the table. Flat, visible. A professional courtesy, showing her he wasn't reaching for anything yet. "I think you've been expecting someone." "Something," she said. "Wasn't sure what shape it would take. Silas Crane hired me, I assumed." "You know why? Grant drew first," she said. "2 witnesses. Sheriff's report is filed in the county record. I read it," Harrow said. "Then you know I was within my rights." "Yes," he said. "I do." A pause. Just long enough to be deliberate. "Silas Crane doesn't put much stock in rights." "No," Ada said. "I don't imagine he does." The room had gone very quiet. Not the silence of people pretending not to listen. The silence of people who had stopped pretending and were just listening, as quietly as they could manage. Harrow looked at her with the specific attention of someone doing a calculation that hasn't finished yet. "The question is whether you'd prefer to come along voluntarily, or whether this becomes something neither of us needs it to be." Ada picked up her glass, took a sip, set it back down. "Before you decide what this is," she said, "there's something you should know about the night Grant Crane died." Something in Harrow's expression shifted, barely. But she caught it. He was listening. Rex was not listening. Rex was thinking about reputation. He looked at Ada with the expression of someone who had already made up his mind and was irritated by the delay. "People say you're the fastest drawer in Mineral County," he said. Ada didn't look at him. Kept her eyes on Harrow. "People say plenty of things," she said. "I heard you dropped Grant Crane in the dark. 30 feet. Now she looked at Rex, 22 years old. Face that hadn't finished deciding what it wanted to be yet. The particular hunger of a young man who had built an identity around a skill and needed to measure that skill against other people's reputations. She recognized it. She'd seen it in other young men. She'd even seen the version of it that survived long enough to become wisdom, in the ones who were lucky enough and careful enough. Rex didn't look particularly careful. "The fastest person in this room," Ada said quietly, "isn't the one who draws first. It's the one who doesn't need to." Rex almost smiled. "Almost. That sounds like something you say when you can't back it up." Or Ada said, "It sounds like something you say when you've backed it up and you understand what backing it up costs." She held his eyes for a moment. "Speed is easy, son. Speed is just reflexes. What's hard is knowing when to use them and when to sit on your hands and think." Rex's almost smile went away. Walt, behind him, looked at the floor. Harrow shifted his weight very slightly. Not discomfort. Something more like recalculation. Ada filed that away and moved on. Outside the saloon, Ada's horse was having a better afternoon than anyone inside. Slate grey, almost the color of wood ash after the fire's gone out. 9 years old. Not the kind of horse that drew attention from strangers. Not fast in the way that made people talk. Just worthy, deeply, consistently, extraordinarily trustworthy in the specific way that certain animals are trustworthy when they've decided that the person they belong to is worth paying attention to. For Thomas had bought Slate when the mare was 3 years old. Ada had gone with him to the seller's barn and watched Thomas walk through 6 horses before stopping at the grey one in the corner. The grey one hadn't been doing anything special. She'd just been standing there. Watching Thomas back. "That one," Thomas had said. "She's the plainest one," Ada had said. "She's the only one that's actually looking at me," Thomas had said. "The others are looking for something. She's just looking." Ada had thought about that a lot in the 2 years since Thomas died, about the difference between looking for something and just looking. Seeing what was actually there instead of what you needed to be there. Slate stood at the hitching post in the August heat with her ears forward, and her muscles holding a specific kind of tension that wasn't panic, wasn't fear, was just attention. The focused attention of an animal that had learned to read situations before they resolved themselves into either safety or danger. Her ears tracked the saloon door. She'd been doing that for 20 minutes. Not stamping, not shifting, not making sounds, just tracking, because inside that building, something was happening. And Slate had spent 9 years learning the difference between Ada walking into a place for ordinary reasons and Ada walking into a place for other reasons. Slate knew. She waited. Inside, Ada was being careful about what she said and how she said it. Not dishonest. Ada Morgan didn't do dishonest. It was one of the things Thomas had loved about her, and also one of the things that had occasionally driven him to distraction. You could soften it a little, he'd say sometimes. You don't have to say the hard thing so directly. If I soften it, she'd tell him, people hear what they want to hear instead of what I'm saying. He'd never had a good answer for that. She told Harrow about Jerome without telling him everything. Just enough. The night Grant came to my farm, she said, there were 3 men. Grant, one other I recognized from town, and a third I didn't know. She watched Harrow's face while she talked, watched his eyes. The third man ran before Sheriff Denton arrived, never gave a statement, didn't come forward. He's still in the area? Harrow said, he's been in Red Rock for 3 weeks. Harrow was quiet for a moment. You've been watching him? I've been aware of him, Ada said. Which was slightly different, and she meant the distinction. His name is Jerome. He knows why Grant Crane came to my property that night. Not just trespassing, not just a property dispute. He knows what Silas asked for and what Silas implied and what Silas would prefer never be said out loud. Harrow's hands on the table didn't move, but something in the set of his jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. Why hasn't Jerome talked already? Rex said. Because he's frightened, Ada said simply. Fear slows people down. Sometimes it stops them entirely. She paused. I understand it. After Thomas died, I spent the better part of a year frightened. Frightened the farm would fail. Frightened something would happen to Claire. Frightened of every sound at night and every rider on the road. She let that sit for a moment. And then I realized something. Nobody spoke. Being frightened wasn't protecting me from anything, she said. It was just making me slower and tired and smaller than I needed to be. She looked at Harrow. Jerome has been frightened for 6 months. I think he's close to the end of that. I think he's ready to do the harder thing. Walt made a small sound. Not words, just sound. The sound of someone who recognized something. Harrow looked at Ada with an expression that had traveled, without her quite seeing the journey, from professional assessment to something more attentive than that. You're buying time, he said. Yes, she said. No point in pretending otherwise. Why would I give it to you? Because you're a professional, she said. And a professional makes better decisions with complete information. Right now you have partial information. You have a warrant and a destination. You don't have the full picture of what you're walking into. She held his gaze. I'm offering you the full picture. Whether you do anything useful with it is your decision. Harrow looked at her for a long moment. The saloon breathed around them. The card players shuffled. The fire in the stove crackled softly despite the August heat. Someone kept it going year-round for the coffee. The sound of the street came through the walls, muffled and distant. Then the door opened. Cal Denton didn't announce himself. He never did. He walked in the way he always walked in, not making a production of it, not scanning the room with the theatrical suspicion of a man who wanted people to see him scanning the room. He just came in, present, solid. The kind of man who took up space without demanding you acknowledge it, 44 years old. Sheriff's badge worn because the job required it, not because he needed the reminder. He had a face that rewarded patience, not unreadable, but requiring time. The lines of it were from weather and years and something else, something more interior. He stopped inside the door, looked at the room, found the corner table without appearing to look for it. 3 unfamiliar men. Ada Morgan. The specific quality of silence that had settled over the room like weather. Cal understood immediately what he was looking at Ada. Without moving her head, met his eyes across 20 feet of sassoon floor. 2 seconds, that was all it took, Don, her eyes said. Everything about the way she sat said it. The stillness of her, the particular angle of her shoulders. Not yet. Stay back, let this breathe. Cal looked at the 3 men. Back at Ada, back at the room. He walked to the bar and said something quiet to the bartender. Sat down on a stool. Accepted a cup of coffee. And stayed. Harrow noticed. Of course he noticed. Sheriff, he said. Comes in most mornings, Ada said. Habit. He's watching this table. He's watching the room, Ada said. He watches everything. It's his job. He's going to be a problem, Rex said. He's going to be exactly as much of a problem as we make him, Ada said. She looked at Rex when she said it, and Rex, to his credit, or perhaps to his survival instinct, received it without argument. If this situation resolves cleanly, the sheriff has nothing to intervene in. If it doesn't resolve cleanly, then yes, he becomes relevant. So let's keep it clean. Harrow looked at Cal at the bar. Cal looked at his coffee. 10 minutes, Harrow said finally. He stood. I need to speak with my men. Rex stood. Walt stood. Walt looked at Ada as he passed. A different look than Rex had given her. Not assessing. Not challenging. Something heavier than either of those things. The look of a man who had been somewhere like this before and wasn't sure he'd made good decisions the first time around. Ada held that look for a moment. Then they were gone through the front door. She exhaled. One breath. One controlled release of what she'd been holding since the three of them had walked in. She had 10 minutes. She stood up. She crossed to the bar. Cal Denton didn't look up from his coffee. But his attention shifted. She could feel it. The way you can feel when someone who has been paying careful attention to you redirects that attention without any visible change in where their eyes are pointing. Don't say anything that sounds like a sheriff, she said quietly. I don't know what that means, he said. It means don't reach for anything. Don't look at the door. Don't sound official. I already know not to look at the door, he said. She sat on the stool beside him. Her back was now to the room. She didn't love that. But there was a warped mirror above the bar, old, slightly discolored at the edges, that gave her a reflection of the door. Imperfect. Good enough, Beck Harrow, she said. Out of Reno. Cal's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Set it down. I know that name. Silas Crane hired him. That's not a surprise, Cal said. No, she looked at his reflection in the mirror, at her own reflection beside it. Two people sitting at a bar having a conversation that looked, from the outside, like nothing. I need you to hold back. Whatever happens in the next hour or two. Don't intervene. Cal was quiet for a moment. There are 3 armed men, he started. I know what they are, Ada said. And I know that if you take them in right now, you can hold them for a day. Maybe 2. Then Silas posts bail. Or Silas sends someone else, someone I don't know. Someone who doesn't walk through the front door of a saloon in the middle of the afternoon. She paused. The kind I can see is manageable. The kind I can't see is the problem. Cal turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. Harrow is a professional, Ada said. Professionals respond to information. They respond to calculation. Rex is impulsive, which is a liability and also in some ways predictable. Walt is, she stopped. Thought about Walt's face. The heaviness of it. Walt is the variable I haven't figured out yet. But I think I'm close. You've been thinking about this, Cal said. I've been thinking about variations of this for 6 months, she said. Since the night I shot Grant Crane. I knew Silas would send someone. I just didn't know who. She looked at the door reflection. Harrow is actually better than what I'd feared. He's professional. He's not emotional about it. That gives me something to work with. Cal was quiet again. In the mirror, Ada looked at his face. She'd known Cal Denton for 2 years. Not the way you know people you choose. More the way you know people your circumstances put in front of you. She'd signed papers in his office. She'd filed the report about Grant. She'd sat across from his desk and watched him write down exactly what had happened without editorializing, without the kind of slow, careful speech some men used when they were explaining something to a woman they'd already decided didn't fully understand. He'd just written it down. That had meant something to her. She hadn't told him so. 1 hour, Cal said finally. Might be 2. 1 hour, he said again, firm but not hard. Then I need to know something has moved. Fair, she said. She went to stand. His hand not grabbing, not insisting, just present. Touched the edge of the counter near hers. Stopped before contact. Like he'd started to say something with his hand and reconsidered. She looked at him. Cole Denton, 44 years old. Widower 5 years. She knew the broad shape of that story. Everyone in Red Rock did. His wife Margaret had died of fever while he was 3 counties over chasing a horse thief. He'd come back to a house where the lamp was still burning in the window, because nobody had turned it off. Ada understood that kind of return. The moment when you walk towards something expecting one thing and get another thing entirely, and your body doesn't catch up for a long time. She hadn't said that to him. This wasn't the moment. But she looked at him and something passed between them. The specific quiet recognition of 2 people who have both learned to keep going without a clear reason why, and who have found, in the absence of clarity, a kind of stubborn adequacy that looks, from the outside, like strength. "Thanks," she said. He nodded once. She went back to the corner table. Harrow came back in first, then Rex, then Walt, who closed the door with the care of a man who did things carefully when given the option. Ada sat across from Harrow. "Tell me what you actually know," she said. "Not what you were told. What you know." Harrow looked at her. "I was told Ada Morgan killed Grant Crane in an unprovoked altercation. Property dispute that escalated." He paused. "I read the actual report before I took the job. The report says something different." "The report says he drew first," Ada said. "Yes, did that bother you? Taking a job on someone the record shows acted in self-defense?" Harrow was quiet for a moment. "I've learned not to ask certain questions," he said finally, "and now." Something moved across his face. "Now I'm asking them." Rex made a sound. Impatient, nobody paid attention to Rex. "Tell me about Thomas Morgan," Harrow said. Ada looked at him, measuring, deciding how much. "Thomas was killed 2 years ago. The official account says it was a confrontation at a card game 3 counties over. Random violence." She kept her voice level. "Thomas didn't gamble. He had no reason to be 3 counties over, and in the 18 months before he died, he'd been documenting land acquisitions in this county. Specifically Silas Crane's acquisitions. Documenting how? Letters to the county land office. Questions about the legality of certain purchases. The way certain deals were structured." She folded her hands on the table. "Nothing that would hold up in a court by itself. But the pattern was visible, if you knew what you were looking at. And Thomas was starting to know what he was looking at." Silence. And then Walt spoke. His voice was rough the way wood is rough when it hasn't been sanded. Not unpleasant, just unfinished. Like he'd stopped working on the surface presentation of himself at some point. "Silas Crane did the same thing in Elko," Walt said. "About a year back, hired men, paid well. When the thing went sideways, he walked clean. Left the hired men with the liability." Harrow looked at him. "I was there," Walt said, still looking at the table. "I'm not proud of that. I've been not proud of it for a year." He paused. "I took this job because I needed the money, and because I told myself it was different this time." "It's not different," Rex stared at Walt. "You never said." "No," Walt said. "I didn't." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. Ada watched Harrow process this, watched the calculation running. Not his face, which was controlled, but his hands on the table. The slight tension in his fingers there, she thought. "That's it, that's the revision." Outside, Slate made a sound. Short, not distress. Attention. Ada stood up without explaining why. She pushed through the saloon door into the weight of August afternoon. Red Rock's Main Street was quiet in the way of towns during the hottest part of the day. People had gone inside. The street itself seemed to be reconsidering its existence. Heat came up off the packed dirt in visible waves. Slate was at the hitching post, ears forward. Head turned approximately 15 degrees toward the alley on the east side of the building. Ada walked to her horse. Put one hand flat on the grey neck. Felt the muscle there, not the loose weight of a relaxed animal. The held readiness of one that had located something and was waiting for more information. She looked at the alley from the corner of her eye. A man standing in the shadow of the building across the way. Not hiding exactly. More like someone who had gotten as close to a decision as he was able to get under his own power, and had run out of momentum just before crossing the finish line. Mid-40s. Stocky build. Hat pulled low enough to mean something without being obvious about it. The look of a man who had been carrying knowledge like it was a stone in his shoe for a long time. Not painful enough to stop walking, painful enough to change how he walked. Ada kept her hand on Slate's neck, kept her voice conversational, like she was talking to a horse, Jerome, she said. Not loud, just directed. "I can see you. You don't have to stand over there." A long pause. Then the man stepped out of the shadow. He moved slowly, the way people move when they're doing something that took a lot of deciding, and they're not sure yet that they've decided right. He stopped about 12 feet away, looked at Ada, looked at the saloon door, looked at the street in both directions. He had the eyes of someone who had been checking over his shoulder for 6 months. "There are men in there," Jerome said. Looking for you, I know, Ada said. Silas Crane sent them. I know that too, Jerome exhaled, a breath that sounded like it had been held for a while. I've been in town 3 weeks, he said. I kept thinking I didn't know what I was going to do. I kept thinking I'd figure it out and then this morning I saw those 3 ride in and I knew, he looked at the ground. I knew if I didn't do something, whatever happens to you is partly on me. Because I was there, and I ran. Ada looked at him. This was the thing she'd hoped for and hadn't counted on. She'd known Jerome was in Red Rock. She'd known he had information. What she hadn't been certain of was whether the weight of it would be enough to move him, or whether fear would keep winning the argument. Fear was persuasive. She knew that better than most. But it had a ceiling. It had a point where the burden of carrying it became heavier than the risk of putting it down. Jerome had hit that point. I didn't know what Grant was going to do, Jerome said. He told me it was just talking, going out there to make a point. That's how Silas framed it, a conversation, an opportunity for the widow to see reason. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite anger. Something in between. I should have known better. I've known Silas Crane my whole life. I knew what he meant when he said conversation, Jerome, Ada said. He looked at her. I need you to come inside. He blinked. In there with Beck Harrow, she said. Yes, she looked at him steadily. Harrow is a professional. He is not a man who is committed to any particular outcome beyond getting paid and not getting himself into legal trouble. Right now, he thinks he has a clear picture of this situation. He doesn't. You can change that. By saying what? By saying what you know, Ada said. About why Grant came that night, about what Silas asked for, about Thomas. Jerome's face changed at Thomas's name. That wasn't. He stopped. I didn't know about Thomas. Not until after. And even then He stopped again. I only heard things. What kind of things? Jerome looked at the street, at the saloon, at Slate, who had turned her head slightly, now that Ada was outside, and was watching Jerome with the calm assessment of a horse that has decided the situation doesn't require action. Silas Crane did not send your husband to a card game, Jerome said quietly. Ada had known this. She had known it the way you know things you don't have proof of, but that fit the shape of everything else, too perfectly to be wrong. She had known it and filed it away, and gotten up at 4 in the morning and watered the corn and gotten on with things, because that was what there was to do. Hearing it said out loud, in August in front of a saloon, by a man who had carried it for 2 years. Something shifted low and deep. She breathed through it, slowly, carefully, the way Thomas had always said she breathed through things, like she was solving an equation instead of feeling a feeling. He was a good man, she thought. He was a good man and he's gone and you can fall apart later. Right now there is work. Come inside, Ada said again. Jerome nodded once, like he was confirming it to himself. They walked to the saloon door together. Inside the corner table, Harrow looked up when the door opened. His eyes went to Jerome immediately. Not dramatically. Just found him. Filed him. Rex looked at Jerome with the expression of someone trying to decide if this was a problem. Walt looked at Jerome and something happened in his face that was quieter and more complicated than anything Rex was capable of at this particular stage of his development. Ada walked to the table. Sat back down, back to the wall. This is Jerome, she said. He was at my farm the night Grant Crane died. He's been in Red Rock for 3 weeks trying to decide what to do with what he knows. She looked at Harrow. I thought you should hear it directly. Harrow looked at Jerome for a moment. Sit down, he said. Jerome sat, and then he talked. He talked for a long time. He talked about the night Silas Crane had come to him. Not formally, not with a direct request. Just a conversation over drinks about the Morgan farm and the widow, and how unfortunate it was that she was being so unreasonable about a straightforward business matter. About how Silas had suggested, in the way Silas always suggested things, that someone ought to go out there and help the widow understand her situation more clearly. He talked about Grant, who had been drinking that night, who had taken Silas's suggestion and added his own interpretation to it. Because Grant Crane had always had difficulty with the gap between what he was authorized to do and what he felt like doing. He talked about standing in Ada Morgan's yard in the dark and watching things go wrong very fast. He talked about running. He talked about 2 years of knowing what he knew and not doing anything with it. Harrow listened to all of it without interrupting. His hands stayed flat on the table. His face stayed controlled. But Ada watched his eyes through the whole thing, and she watched them revise, continuously and completely. The calculation he'd been running since he walked in. Every assumption of it, being updated in real time. Rex was very still. Walt had his eyes closed, like he was hearing something he'd been waiting to hear for a year. When Jerome finished, the saloon held a silence that felt like something had just been decided. Not by anyone in particular, but by the weight of what had been said pressing down on everything until the picture changed shape. Harrow looked at Ada, the U.S. Marshal's office in Carson City. He said, "Yes," she said. "If Jerome gives testimony, it's enough to open an investigation into both Thomas's death and Grant's actions that night," she said. "Enough to put Silas Crane in a position where he's answering to federal authority, not county. Enough to change the calculation on everything." Harrow was quiet for a long. Rex opened his mouth. "Don't," Harrow said. Rex closed it. Walt opened his eyes. Harrow looked at the table, then at Ada, then at Jerome, then at his own hands, flat against the wood like he was reading something in them. "The warrant I'm carrying," he said, "is not worth what I thought it was worth when I took it." Ada said nothing. "Silas Crane hired me based on information that was incomplete," Harrow said. "Deliberately incomplete." He paused. "I don't like being given incomplete information." "No," Ada said. "I didn't imagine you would." Another pause. "Jerome comes with me to Carson City," Harrow said. "U.S. Marshal." "Today?" "Yes," Ada said. "This warrant." He picked it up from where he'd set it earlier, looked at it. "This isn't what I agreed to carry." He set it on the table between them. Ada looked at it. She didn't touch it. Rex made a sound. Complicated. Young man sounds, surprise and recalculation, and something that might have been underneath it all, a kind of relief at not having to do the thing he'd been not entirely sure about since they'd ridden in. Walt stood up slowly. "I'll ride to Carson City," Walt said. "Corroborate what I know about Elko. That might matter to the marshal." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Harrow nodded. Outside, through the walls, came the sound of Slate moving. Not in alarm, just adjusting her position at the hitching post. The specific small sound of a horse settling, done holding tension. Letting it go because the thing it had been holding tension about had resolved. Ada heard it, breathed in, breathed out, looked at Harrow across the table. "There's still Silas," Harrow said, "even with a federal investigation. He'll know something moved. He'll adjust, I know," Ada said. "What are you going to do about that?" Ada picked up her glass of rye, looked at it, set it back down. "Tonight," she said, "I'm going to go home and make sure my daughter has supper. I'm going to check the cornfield and make sure the irrigation held from this morning. I'm going to sit on the porch until it gets dark enough that I can see the stars." She paused. "And tomorrow I'm going to deal with Silas Crane." "How?" Harrow said. "The only way that lasts," Ada said. "By making sure he understands that the cost of continuing is higher than the cost of stopping." Harrow looked at her for a long moment. Whatever calculation he'd been running, since he walked in, had finished. The result of it was in his face. Not warmly, not dramatically. Just conclusive. The specific expression of a man who has arrived somewhere and acknowledged where he is. "You're an unusual woman, Mrs. Morgan," he said. "No," Ada said. "I'm just a farmer who learned to think clearly under pressure." She looked at him. "Most people can do that. They just don't know it until they have to." Rex was looking at his hands. Walt had already stood Jerome, across the table, the weight visibly different on him. Lighter in the way that things get lighter when you finally set them down. Looked at Ada and nodded once. She nodded back. Outside, the August heat pressed down on Red Rock. Nevada like something that had been there forever and planned to stay. Slate stood at the hitching post, ears relaxed, head forward waiting, like she always waited. Like she'd never had any doubt about how this particular afternoon was going to go. The coffee in Cal Denton's office had gone cold. He hadn't noticed until he picked it up. Drank it anyway. Cold coffee was still coffee. You didn't get to be particular about things like temperature, when you'd been sitting at a desk since 6 in the morning, trying to decide how much trouble was walking toward your town. Now he knew considerable trouble, the organized kind. Ada Morgan sat across from his desk in the chair that had a slight wobble on the left rear leg. He kept meaning to fix it, hadn't yet, and told him everything. Not hurriedly, not dramatically, the way Ada Morgan told things, which was with the specific economy of someone who had learned that every unnecessary word was a distraction from the necessary ones. Beck, Harrow, Walt, Rex, Jerome. What Jerome had said, what Harrow had decided, what was happening right now, which was Harrow and Walt and Jerome were saddling up to ride for Carson City. And Rex was sitting in Ruth's saloon, drinking something stronger than coffee, and looking like a young man who had recently had a foundational assumption revised without his full consent. Cal listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Jerome, he said. Why didn't he come to me? Because you're the county sheriff, Ada said. Silas Crane has relationships in this county. Contracts, agreements. Jerome didn't know whose side you'd land on. Cal looked at her. He does now, Ada said, evenly. Without judgment, Cal absorbed that. It wasn't comfortable. The idea that people in his town had been sitting on information because they weren't sure he was trustworthy was not comfortable at all. But discomfort wasn't a reason to argue with a true thing. The U.S. Marshal in Carson City, Cal said. If Harrow delivers Jerome, it opens a federal investigation, Ada said, which changes everything. Silas has managed county-level exposure for years because he understands the county. Federal is different. Federal takes time. Yes, she said. It does. And in the meantime, it wasn't a question. It was the shape of the problem. In the meantime, the gap between now and whenever federal authority arrived and did whatever federal authority was going to do, that gap was where Silas Crane lived. That gap was where men like Silas had always operated most effectively, in the time between when something was set in motion and when it landed. In the meantime, Ada said, I'm going to go see Silas. Cal set his coffee cup down. Carefully, no, he said. It's not a request for permission, Ada said. Ada, Cal. She said his name the way she said most things, directly. No softening around the edges. Silas is going to find out about Jerome by tomorrow morning. Probably tonight. You can't stop that. Someone always talks, someone always rides. That's how it works. She held his gaze. When he finds out, he's going to make a decision. I want to be part of the conversation that shapes what that decision is. Or he puts a bullet in you. He won't, she said. Silas Crane doesn't do things directly. He never has. That's his method. That's why he's operated this long without legal consequence. He suggests. He implies. He hires. He doesn't do. She paused. If I walk into his house tonight, he can't hire anyone to make me not have walked in. He has to talk to me. Cal looked at her for a long time. The afternoon light came through the single window of his office at a low angle, the way it did in August, long and amber, and making everything look slightly more significant than it probably was. Ada Morgan in that light looked the way she usually looked, which was like a woman who had decided something and was now simply executing it. Calm, contained. The specific calmness of a person who has already done their fearing earlier, somewhere private, and come out the other side with a plan. I don't like it, Cal said. You don't have to like it, Ada said. I'm telling you because you deserve to know. Not because I need your approval. Another long pause. When? He said. Tonight. After dark, I'm coming. You're not, Ada. If you come, it looks like a legal action. She said. It looks like the county moving against him. That changes his response. He lawyers up. He goes defensive. He starts managing the situation instead of considering it. She shook her head slightly. I need him to consider it. I need him to sit across from me and understand what it costs him to keep going. That only works if it's just me. Cal looked at his hands. He had large hands. A working man's hands, though the work had changed over the years from physical to something more like management. Managing situations. Managing people. Managing the gap between what the law said and what justice looked like in a county, where the two things didn't always point in the same direction. You'll tell me before you go, he said, and you'll come back. It wasn't a question or a command. It was the specific statement of a man who was not giving someone permission because they didn't need his permission. but who was saying out loud that he would be aware and present, and that those things mattered to him. Ada looked at him. Something passed between them. The same thing that had passed in the bar mirror, that quiet recognition. Two people who had learned to keep going. Two people who understood what it meant to come home to something changed and then keep coming home anyway. "I'll tell you before I go," she said. She stood, smoothed her skirt, moved toward the door. "Ada," Cal said. She stopped. Jerome said it wasn't a card game. His voice was level. Doing his job, keeping his voice level was part of the job. With Thomas, Ada's hand was on the doorframe. "I know," she said. "You've known? 2 years?" she said. "Yes, and you've just kept going," she said. "Yes." She turned her head, not fully, not looking at him directly, just enough to include him in the sentence. "What else would I do?" She walked out. Cal sat in his office with cold coffee and the amber afternoon light and the wobble on the chair's left rear leg and the weight of everything he'd just been told. He picked up his pen, started writing a report, because whatever happened next, there needed to be a record, clear and accurate and dated. Thomas Morgan's wife deserved that, at minimum. Thomas Morgan deserved that. Rex was still at Ruth's saloon. He was on his 3rd drink, which was one more than he usually had in the afternoon. But the afternoon had been unusual, and he was making adjustments. The saloon had resumed its normal rhythms around him. The card players were back to their game. The bartender was cleaning things. Someone had come in for a late lunch and was eating quietly at a table near the door. The ordinary machinery of an ordinary Tuesday in a small Nevada town, except Rex was sitting in the middle of it, feeling like the floor had shifted. He wasn't used to that feeling. He'd built his identity carefully over the past 3 or 4 years. He knew what he was. He was good with a gun, genuinely good, not just in his own estimation, though his own estimation had never been what you'd call modest. He was fast. He was accurate. He'd taken 4 jobs with Harrow over 2 years, and acquitted himself fine in all of them. He was the kind of man, he'd thought, who knew how situations worked. Today had suggested otherwise. He kept turning it over. The conversation at the corner table. Ada Morgan sitting there with her back to the wall, and her glass of rye, and her voice that didn't go up or down or get louder or quieter, regardless of what she was saying. The way she'd looked at him when he'd said what he'd said about speed. The fastest person in this room isn't the one who draws first. He'd thought it was a dodge, an excuse, the kind of thing people said when they were buying time or covering weakness. And maybe it had been both of those things. She'd admitted she was buying time. Straight out, no pretense. But the thing was, it had also been true. And he hadn't seen that until later. Until after Jerome had talked, and Harrow had made his decision, and Walt had agreed to ride to Carson City, and the warrant had been set on the table like something that had been misidentified. She'd seen how it would go. Before it went there, she'd seen the whole shape of it, while Rex had been sitting across from her, thinking about whether he was faster than she was. He was embarrassed about that. He didn't have a lot of practice at being embarrassed, and he didn't particularly enjoy it. The bartender came over. Another. The young man said. Rex looked at his glass. "Coffee," he said. The bartender looked at him with mild surprise. "Sure," he said. Rex sat with the coffee when it came, held it with both hands, thought about Harrow riding for Carson City with Walt and Jerome, thought about what Harrow had said when he'd told Rex he'd be staying behind, in case there was anything that needed managing in Red Rock. "Stay out of trouble," Harrow had said. "And think about what you saw today, what Rex had seen today." He'd seen a woman with a glass of rye and her back to the wall look at 3 armed men and not flinch. Not because she was fearless. He understood now that fearlessness had nothing to do with it. Because she'd already done her calculating. Because she'd already run the situation in her head every possible way and arrived at a plan. Because she'd been, in the truest sense, ready. Not fast ready. There's a difference, he thought. And it was a new thought. The particular slight discomfort of a new thought in a head that was used to older ones. He drank his coffee. Out the window, he could see the general shape of Red Rock going about its business. People walking, a wagon moving slowly. A dog had started barking again somewhere behind the livery. Rex thought about Provo, about Walt with his kids in Provo. Walt, who had taken this job because he needed the money, and who had spent the whole time looking like someone who had gotten on a road and kept going past the point where they should have turned around. Rex was 22 years old. He thought about that 22, which meant he had, 40, 50 years, if he was careful and lucky and didn't make the kind of mistake that ended things early. 40 years of being the person he was becoming. What kind of person was he becoming? He'd been assuming one kind. He was less sure now. The coffee was hot and real, and he drank it slowly, and watched Red Rock through the window and allowed himself, just for a few minutes, to be uncertain. Which was something he hadn't permitted himself in a long time, because uncertainty felt too much like weakness. But sitting there in the saloon in Red Rock, Nevada, on a Tuesday in August 1879, Rex was starting to understand that uncertainty wasn't weakness, it was information. And information, as a woman with grey eyes and a back-to-the-wall policy had demonstrated today, was the only thing that actually mattered. Ada got home before the worst of the afternoon heat broke. Claire was in the yard when Slate came up the road. 7 years old, hair escaping from her braid in about 6 different directions, barefoot despite having been told approximately 40 times this summer that the yard had rocks and the rocks had edges. She ran to the fence when she heard Slate's hooves. "Mama, Claire, you're late. Mrs. Henderson said you'd be back by 3. Mrs. Henson was optimistic, Ada said. She dismounted. Let Claire take Slate's reins. Claire had been was learning with the specific, focused intensity of a child who has decided she is going to master something and will not be deterred. Easy with her. She's had a long afternoon. She's always had a long afternoon when you say that, Claire said, leading Slate toward the small barn with the careful, exaggerated deliberateness of someone trying very hard to do something right. It means something happened. Ada looked at her daughter, 7 years old, Thomas's eyes, direct and brown, set in a face that was still soft with childhood, but was already showing the angles it would become. Thomas's stubbornness, which Ada had complained about regularly for 5 years of marriage and missed every single day now. Her own something, she wasn't sure what. Other people told her Claire had her mother's stillness, her mother's way of watching things. Ada hoped that was true. She wanted Claire to watch things carefully. Something happened, Ada said. Nothing that will harm us. I'll explain more later. Is it about Mr. Crane? Ada looked at her. Why would it be about Mr. Crane? Claire led Slate through the barn door with the air of a 7-year-old who is pretending she didn't say something. People talk in town, she said. I hear things. What things? That he's been looking for a reason, Claire said it simply. The way children sometimes say complicated things without the framework of knowing why they're complicated. Just the instinct that they matter, that he wants our farm. Ada stood in the doorway of the barn. Claire, she said. Her daughter looked at her. He's not going to get it, Ada said. Claire looked at her with Thomas's eyes. I know, she said. Not because she'd been reassured. Because she believed it, Ada breathed in. Something in her chest that had been tight for most of the afternoon loosened, just slightly, not all the way. But enough. Put Slate's feed in before you come for supper, Ada said. She went to check the corn the irrigation had held. Ada walked the field the way she walked it every evening. Systematically, row by row, reading the plants the way she'd learned to read them from Thomas, who had learned from his father, who had broken this particular patch of Nevada ground before Ada was born, and passed the knowledge of it on like a language. Corn in August in Nevada required constant attention. The heat was aggressive. The soil gave up its moisture grudgingly. You had to know the signs. The slight curl of a leaf that meant stress was coming. The color shift at the stalk base that meant the roots were working harder than they should. Ada knew the signs. She walked the rows and read the plants and let the act of it, the physical, rooted, real act of it, do what it always did, which was remind her what was actually important. This field, Claire in the barn talking to Slate. The fact that the irrigation held everything else. Harrow and his warrant, Jerome on his way to Carson City, Silas Crane sitting somewhere in his large house deciding what to do next. All of that was real. All of it mattered. But it was not the thing she was working toward. It was the obstacle between her and the thing. The thing was this: a farm, a daughter. The small and stubborn life she had built, and was continuing to build in Thomas's absence. Thomas had been dead for 2 years. She'd been angry at him for the first 6 months. Not logically. She knew it wasn't logic. Angry the way you get angry at something that was supposed to keep going and didn't. She'd made a life on the assumption that he'd be in it. He'd revised that assumption without consulting her, and the adjustment had been brutal. After the anger came something she hadn't expected: clarity. It had arrived slowly. First in small things, the specific satisfaction of a fence post she'd put in herself and put in correctly, the pride of a harvest she'd brought in without help, the way Claire looked at her when Ada fixed things, solved things, decided things, with the particular attention of a child watching a parent and learning what adults do. Ada had started to understand something. She was living past it. Not surviving. Surviving was just waiting for the danger to pass. Living past it meant you made the life from what was available and kept making it. She was doing that. She was going to keep doing it. She walked the rows and confirmed the irrigation held. Then she went inside to make supper. She made cornbread and beans and sliced the last of the salt pork. Claire ate with the focused efficiency of a child who has been running around outside all afternoon and is very serious about the business of refueling. They sat at the table that Thomas had built. Heavy oak, slightly uneven on the surface because Thomas had been many things, and a precise carpenter had not been among them. Ada had always meant to plane it flat and never had. Now she was glad. The slight irregularity of it felt like him, like sitting at a table that still carried the evidence of his hands. "Tell me about today," Ada said. Claire told her about the Henderson kids, who were fine but loud, about a hawk she'd seen over the south field, about a caterpillar she'd found on the fence post and then lost again, about Mrs. Henderson's opinion on the coming winter, which Claire relayed with the precision of someone who had been listening carefully and didn't entirely understand all of it, but wanted to report accurately. Ada listened. She ate. She let herself be here, in this specific place, with this specific person, on this specific evening that smelled like cornbread and late summer, and the particular quality of Nevada air after the sun started down. She was going to deal with Silas tonight, but right now she was here. Thomas had taught her that too. Not on purpose, by example. He had been, in a way she hadn't fully appreciated until he was gone, a person who was present, who was where he was when he was there, who sat at this table and ate and listened, and was genuinely interested in caterpillars on fence posts. She was trying to be that person for Claire, for herself, for the memory of someone who had deserved better than what he got, and whom she loved, and was still learning to mourn, without letting the mourning swallow the living. "Mama," Claire said. You're thinking about something heavy." Ada looked at her. "How do you know? You get a line." Claire pointed at the space between her own eyebrows. "Right here." "When you're thinking about something heavy," Ada touched her forehead. "I'll work on that. It's okay," Claire said. "Papa had it too." Ada looked at her daughter. "He did," she said. "It means you're taking things seriously," Claire said with the philosophical confidence of someone who has recently worked something out. "That's not bad. That's just how you are." Ada breathed in, breathed out. "Help me with the dishes," she said. "And then bed." She told Cal, before she left, knocked on his door at 9 o'clock. He opened it in his shirt sleeves, holding a coffee cup, looking like a man who had not been sleeping, but had been attempting to look like a man who had been sleeping. He opened the door wider. She came in. His house was small and specific, the house of a person who had stopped acquiring things at some point and made do with what was already there. Furniture that was functional and worn, books she hadn't expected, a jacket hanging by the door that had been there so long it was part of the house now. No photographs. She noticed that. One dried flower on the windowsill that had been there long enough to be very, very dry. Margaret, probably. She didn't say anything about it. "I'm going now," she said. Cal set his coffee cup on the table. "I'll saddle." "You won't. We discussed this. We discussed it, and I didn't agree." "You don't need to agree," Ada said. Not unkind, just clear. "I'm not asking you to agree. I'm telling you where I'm going so that if something goes wrong, you know where to look." Cal looked at her. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be reassuring, she said. It's meant to be accurate. He was quiet for a moment. Silas Crane has guards, Cal said. He's had them since Grant. I know, she said. I've been watching his property. Cackle stared at her. For how long? Since March. You've been watching. He stopped, started again. Ada, you've been watching a man's property for 5 months without telling me. You're the county sheriff, she said, the same way she'd said it that afternoon. I wasn't sure. I know, he said quickly. Jerome said the same thing. I'm not. He ran his hand through his hair. I'm not angry. He stopped. Surprised, she said. Somebody looked at him. Cal Denton, standing in his kitchen in his shirt sleeves at 9 o'clock at night, surprised. It was a different face than his sheriff face. More unfinished, more present somehow. Like the job was a kind of armor, and he'd set it down when he came home and hadn't put it back on yet. She liked this face better, she thought. She didn't say that. Silas will have 2 men outside, she said. There's a 40-second gap in their rotation on the east side. It happens every time, same hour. I've counted it 7 times over 5 months. She paused. I go through the east side. Back door has been unlocked every time I've observed it. I believe he doesn't check it because he trusts his guards, and his guards watch the front. Cal looked at her. You've been planning this, he said. I've been prepared, she said. Planning implies I knew when. I didn't. I just wanted to be ready when the when arrived. And now it's arrived. Now it's arrived. He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she became aware of the specific quiet of his house. The way sound worked differently in other people's spaces. Their silences had different textures than your own. Come back, he said. Not be careful. Not I'll be here. Not any of the things people said. Just come back. Ada looked at him. I will, she said. She meant it. She walked out. Slate moved in the dark like she always moved. Without wasted motion, without drama. Ada didn't push her. The road to Silas Crane's property ran north along a dry creek bed for 6 miles before branching up toward the larger land holdings in the valley's upper end. Good road in daylight, manageable in darkness if you knew it. Ada knew it. She'd ridden it in daylight, in rain, in the specific early morning dark before Thomas died, when they'd sometimes ridden out together to check the fence line at the north boundary. She rode it now and let Slate find the pace and thought about Thomas. Not with grief, not actively. More like she thought about him the way you think about the weather that made you who you are. Formative. Present in the result, even when it was past. Thomas had believed in confronting things directly. Not confrontation for its own sake. Not aggression. Just he'd believed that the longer you let a problem sit unaddressed, the larger it grew in your imagination, and imagination could make things worse than they actually were. Go look at it, he'd say. Whatever it is, go look it in the face. It's almost always smaller than you thought. He'd been right about most things. He'd been wrong about Silas Crane. He'd thought that asking legitimate questions through legitimate channels would produce legitimate results. He'd believed in the county system. He'd believed that the pattern he was documenting would eventually be visible to the right people. He'd been right that the pattern was visible. He'd underestimated how much Silas Crane had invested in making sure the right people were looking elsewhere. Ada had learned from that. She had been thorough. She had gone through channels, but she'd also been building parallel structures. The documentation she'd given Harrow, the observations she'd made of Silas's property, the conversations she'd had, carefully and indirectly, with Jerome over 3 weeks, without Jerome knowing he was being encouraged toward a decision. Preparation wasn't the same as planning. Planning assumed you knew what was coming. Preparation meant you were ready for what you hadn't anticipated. She was ready. Slate's ears moved forward as the property came into view. Ada slowed her to a walk, then to a stop. The house was large for this part of Nevada. Silas had built it to communicate something, importance, permanence, the weight of a man who intended to keep acquiring and growing, and pressing outward until there was nothing left to acquire. It was lit in 3 windows. The guards were visible as shapes at the front. Ada watched for 20 minutes. Timed the rotation, 43 seconds, east side. Same as before, she tied Slate to a cottonwood off the road. Loose knot, The kind that would hold the horse comfortably but give if it needed to give. She'd learned that from Thomas too. Don't bind things tighter than necessary. She moved through the dark on the east side of the property. Slow, no hurry. The back door was unlocked. She opened it, stepped inside, closed it behind her, stood still for 30 seconds while her eyes adjusted to the interior dark. Not full dark, lamplight from somewhere in the front of the house bleeding through the interior. She crossed to the parlor. She sat in the chair nearest the cold fireplace. She waited. Silas Crane came into his own parlor at 10:20. He was still dressed. He was the kind of man who didn't move to informal clothing until late, as though the day required keeping up appearances even in private. He carried a glass of bourbon. He walked in the way of a man who owns everything in his sightline. He saw Ada. The bourbon glass stopped. Not dropped, not fumbled, just stopped. Silas Crane was 55 years old, and he had built his fortune on the ability to project calm in uncomfortable situations. He had negotiated land deals and business agreements, and various arrangements that existed below the official record, while maintaining the composure of a man at a church social. He was very good at this. He was good at it now, except his hand, the one holding the glass, a tremor, small, gone almost immediately, but Ada had been watching hands all day and she saw it. "Mrs. Morgan," he said. "Mr. Crane," she said. "I apologize for the hour." She didn't apologize for being there. She apologized for the hour. The distinction was deliberate. Silas looked at the door behind her. "The windows. Your men are fine," Ada said. "I didn't interact with them. I'm not here to cause a scene. You're sitting in my parlor uninvited at 10 in the evening," Silas said. He moved, not toward her, not toward the desk where she assumed he kept something useful. Just moved to the chair across from her. Sat. The way a man sits when he's decided that standing is the wrong choice because sitting says he's not alarmed. He was alarmed. "Jerome is on his way to Carson City," Ada said. "With Beck Harrow. They'll be at the U.S. Marshal's office by morning." Silas held his bourbon glass, looked at it, set it on the small table beside his chair. "Jerome," he said. "He was at my farm the night Grant came," Ada said. "You know that, you've known it. You've been hoping he'd stay frightened long enough that it wouldn't matter." Silas said nothing. "He stopped being frightened today," Ada said. The parlor was quiet. Outside, somewhere distant, a coyote said something to the dark. The lamp on the side table threw a warm, contained light that made the room feel smaller than it was. Silas looked at Ada the way he had looked at her before, as a problem, a variable, a thing to be managed. She could see the machinery of it working in his face. "What does Jerome know?" Silas said. "What he told Beck Harrow today," Ada said, "which is the same as what he'll tell the U.S. Marshal tomorrow. Why Grant came to my property. What you asked for, what you implied." She held his gaze. And what he heard about Thomas, something changed in Silas Crane's face. Not guilt exactly, not shame. Something more self-interested than either of those. The expression of a man calculating how much something is about to cost him. "Thomas," Ada said, "didn't die in a card game." Silas was quiet. "I've known that for 2 years," she said. "Jerome confirmed it today, and Jerome will confirm it to the marshal tomorrow, along with everything else." She paused. "That's a federal matter now, Mr. Crane. Not county, not local. Federal." The clock on the mantel measured the silence. Silas picked up his bourbon, held it. "Didn't drink it. What do you want?" he said finally. "I want you to stop," Ada said. He looked at her. "Not because I've forgiven you," she said. "I haven't. I'm not sure I will. What you took from me, what you took from Claire, I don't have words for that are fit for polite company, and I won't pretend otherwise." She kept her voice level, the way she kept everything level when the alternative was something she couldn't afford. "But continuing costs you more than stopping. That's the arithmetic. Jerome is already gone. The federal record is being made. You can spend the next 10 years sending people and escalating, and every escalation adds to that record. Or you can stop." Silas looked at the bourbon. "My brother is dead," he said. "I know," Ada said. "He drew first. That's documented. That's the record. I won't apologize for surviving. He was my brother, and Thomas was my husband," Ada said quietly. "We're not going to agree on the accounting, Mr. Crane. We're just going to agree on whether more people die over it or they don't." Long silence. The clock ticked. The coyote outside had gone quiet. Silas Crane sat in his parlor with his bourbon, and the specific stillness of a man who has arrived at an intersection he did not expect, and is understanding for the first time that both roads have real costs. "You rode out here alone," he said finally. "Not threatening, observing." "Yes," Ada said. "To tell me this, to make sure you understood it directly," she said, "from me. Without intermediary, without anyone else's interpretation of what I'm willing to accept." She paused. "I'm willing to accept this ending here." Jerome testifies. "The federal investigation proceeds. Whatever that means for you, it proceeds. And my farm is my farm, and my daughter grows up without any more men coming to our property at night." Silas looked at her. "A long time, you're 33 years old," he said. It wasn't an insult, it sounded almost like something else, surprise maybe. The specific surprise of a man who had categorized someone as a manageable problem, and is revising that category under dem. "Yes," Ada said. "You've been running that farm alone for 2 years." "Yes, and you rode out here tonight." "To talk to you," Ada said. "Yes." She looked at him evenly. "I'm a farmer, Mr. Crane. I understand investment and return. I understand that some things you plant take years to come up, and some things you have to cut before they take the whole field." She paused. "You've been investing in the wrong thing. I'm telling you to stop before the cost gets larger than you can manage." Silas was quiet for a very long time. The lamp flickered once, settled. "If I said I would consider what you've said," Silas said slowly, "that would not be an admission." Ada said, "No, it would be a man who is smart enough to understand the terrain he's on." She stood. "You don't have to tell me anything tonight. You just have to know that I'll know what your answer is by what happens next." She picked up her hat from her lap, stood mauve toward the door. "Mrs. Morgan," Silas said. She stopped. "Jerome," he said. "There's nothing I can do about Jerome now." "No," Ada said. "There isn't, and the federal investigation proceeds regardless," Ada said. "I'm not here to stop it. I'm here to offer you the option of not making it worse." Silas looked at her. She looked back. Then she walked out through the front door. Not the back, the front. Through the entrance and past the guards, who looked at her with significant confusion, and down the front path to the road. One of the guards said something. She kept walking. Slate was where she'd left her, tied to the cottonwood, the loose knot still holding. Slate raised her head when she heard Ada's footsteps on the road and dropped it again. Ada untied the reins, stood for a moment. The Nevada sky above her was enormous in the specific way of desert skies after dark, larger than daytime somehow, like the absence of sun revealed the actual scale of things. Stars ran from horizon to horizon in numbers that were almost unmanageable. Thomas had loved this sky. She looked at it for a long moment. "I'm trying," she thought. "Not to anyone specific. Or maybe to someone specific. I'm handling it. I'm keeping the farm. Claire's growing up. I'm okay." She mounted road south 2 miles down the road. A figure on horseback was waiting at a bend in the creek. Cal Denton. Ada slowed Slate. Pulled up alongside him. "You said you weren't coming," she said. "I didn't come to the house," he said. "I came to this road. That's a distinction. I'm good at distinctions," he said. "It's part job." She looked at him. He looked back. His hat was slightly off-center the way it got when he'd been riding fast and hadn't stopped to adjust it. He had the look of a man who had told himself he was going to wait at his house and had lasted about 45 minutes before discovering that he was, in fact, on a horse on the road north. She didn't say anything about it. "How did it go?" Cal said. He listened, said. "What he does with it, I don't know yet. Do you think he'll stop?" Ada thought about Silas Crane's face in the lamplight, the bourbon glass. The way his hand had trembled for half a second. "I think he'll consider stopping," she said. "I think it depends on what the federal investigation produces, and on whether he decides the arithmetic works in his favor. And if it doesn't, then we deal with what comes next," Ada said. Cal was quiet for a moment. "You're very calm about things that would not leave most people calm," he said. "I've had time to practice," she said. They rode south together in the dark, parallel, not side by side exactly. The road was narrow in places, but within easy conversation distance. Slate and Cal's horse found a compatible rhythm without being asked. The desert gave off the heat it had stored all day, steady and warm against the cooling air. "My wife's name was Margaret," Cal said. not as a non sequitur, as a thing he'd decided to say. "The way you decide to say something you've been not saying for a while, I know," Ada said. "People mention it, she would have." He stopped. She was someone who did things directly, said what she meant, didn't go around the outside of things. A pause. "I see that in you sometimes. He stopped again. Ada let him stop. "Let it be quiet, I'm sorry about Thomas," Cal said. "Thank you," Ada said. They rode. The stars went on. Somewhere ahead, Red Rock's few lights were visible, small and warm and real in the wide, dark Nevada night. Home, both of them. Going back to it. Red Rock woke up the way it always woke up, slowly, reluctantly. The way a town wakes up when it knows the day is going to be hot before it even starts, and has no particular enthusiasm about that fact. The blacksmith's hammer started at 6. The general store opened at 6:30. The dog behind the livery resumed its commentary on existence at approximately 6:45. These were the sounds of a Tuesday becoming a Wednesday, and they were the same sounds they'd been for 15 years, and they would probably be the same sounds for 15 more. Ada was already in her cornfield at 5:30. She'd been there since before the sky lightened. Hadn't slept much, not because she was frightened. She'd moved past frightened somewhere on the ride home from Silas Crane's property, somewhere in the dark with Cal Denton riding alongside her, and the stars going on overhead in their indifferent and enormous way. She just didn't sleep well after certain kinds of days. Thomas had known that about her. He'd had a way of dealing with it. Not talking, not asking if she was all right, just being present. Getting up when she got up. Making coffee without being asked. Sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with her until the dark started going away. She missed that. She was learning to replace it with the field. The corn didn't care what had happened the day before. The corn didn't know about Beck Harrow, or Jerome, or the parlor conversation with Silas Crane. The corn needed water and attention, and the particular kind of looking that let you see what was actually happening, rather than what you expected to see. Ada walked the rows, ride the plants, thought about nothing except the plants. For about 20 minutes that worked. Then she thought about Silas Crane sitting in his parlor with his bourbon and his trembling hand, and the specific stillness of a man understanding that the arithmetic had shifted. She thought about what he'd do with that understanding, whether the weight of it would be enough, whether a man who had operated the way he'd operated for 20 years could actually stop, or whether stopping felt too much like losing. She thought about Jerome. Somewhere on the road to Carson City right now, or maybe already there, sleeping in a roadside inn, getting up this morning and eating breakfast and thinking about what he was going to say to the marshal. She thought about Walt, also headed that way, carrying a year of Elko with him like a stone he'd finally found a place to put down. She thought about Rex. Rex was the one she thought about longest, actually. Not because he was a threat. She didn't think he was, not anymore. Because he was 22 years old, and he'd sat across from her yesterday, and she'd watched something happen in him that she didn't have a name for yet. A revision. The beginning of one, at least. The particular look of someone who has discovered that the story they've been telling about themselves has a chapter they didn't know was in it. She hoped he did something useful with that. You couldn't make someone do something useful with that kind of moment. You could only offer it and let them take it or not. She'd offered it. The rest was up to Rex. The sky finished deciding to be morning. Light came over the eastern ridge in long flat stripes, turning the corn silver, then gold, then just corn-colored again as the sun fully committed to the day. Ada straightened up. Her back ached in the specific location it always ached. The left side, lower, where she'd strained it 2 winters ago hauling fence posts alone because there had been no one else to haul them. It had healed mostly, not completely. She suspected it never would, completely. She was learning to work around it. She heard the kitchen door. Claire, up earlier than usual, standing on the back step in her nightgown with her hair in the state it always achieved overnight, which was spectacular. "Mama, morning. There's a man outside the front fence." Ada turned. "What man? Don't know him," Claire said. "He's just standing there. He doesn't look dangerous." A pause. "He looks sad." Ada walked back to the house. Rex was standing at the fence, hat in his hands. The hat that yesterday had been worn with the specific angle of a young man who had thought about what his hat communicated and was communicating it intentionally. This morning the hat was just in his hands and the angle was whatever angle happened when you weren't thinking about it. He looked younger than yesterday. That was the thing about 22. Sometimes you saw all of it at once, and sometimes it receded and you saw the underneath of it, the part that was still uncertain and soft, and hadn't calcified yet into who the person was going to be. Ada walked to the fence. Rex looked at her, looked at his hat. Back at her. "I don't know what I'm doing here," he said. "That's all right," Ada said. "You can not know what you're doing here on the porch if you'd like, rather than at the fence." He looked at the gate. She opened it. He came in. They sat on the porch steps. Claire materialized at the door with 2 cups of coffee, strong, the way Ada made it, and set them down and disappeared back inside with the discretion of a child who has sensed an adult situation and is handling it through strategic absence. Rex looked at the coffee like he hadn't expected it. He picked it up. "I've been thinking since yesterday," he said. "I know," Ada said. "How do you know?" "Because you're here at 7 in the morning at a farm, instead of wherever young men with guns go when a job falls apart," she said. "That's the kind of thing that comes from a night of thinking." Rex turned the coffee cup in his hands. Slow rotation. The same motion Cal had made with his coffee cup the evening before. She wondered if it was something men did, handling a cup carefully when they were being careful with something else. "I've been doing this work for 2 years, Rex said. "I thought I was good at it." "You probably are good at it," Ada said. "Good at the technical part. But being good at the technical part of something is not the same as being good at the thing," Ada said. "It's a start. It's not a finish." Rex was quiet for a moment. "Harrow," he said. "He made a decision yesterday that I've never seen him do that. In 2 years, I've never seen him walk away from a job." "He didn't walk away," Ada said. "He redirected." "There's a difference. What's the difference?" Ada looked out at the cornfield. The morning light was full on it now, turning the whole field into something that looked deliberately beautiful. Though it wasn't, it was just corn in sun, doing what corn does. "Walking away is refusing to engage," she said. "Redirecting is understanding that the engagement you thought you were having isn't the engagement that's actually in front of you. And adjusting accordingly." She paused. Harrow saw the real situation and chose the real response. That's harder than following the original plan. It requires letting go of what you thought you knew. Rex absorbed this. "That's what you were doing yesterday," he said. "The whole time. You weren't just buying time. You were showing him the real situation, showing everyone the real situation," Ada said. "Including Walt." Rex looked at the field. "Walt knew about Elko. Walt knew about Elko," Ada confirmed. "He never said anything. The whole ride from Reno, he never." Rex stopped. "He was waiting, he was deciding," Ada said. "Same as Jerome. Same as you right now." She looked at him directly. "Rex, what is it you actually want to do? Not with today." With the years, he blinked, like no one had asked him that in a long time. "Or possibly ever, I don't know," he said. "That's honest," Ada said. "That's a better starting place than most people begin with." He looked at his coffee. Back at the field. Back at her. "You're not what I expected," he said. "No," Ada said. "I rarely am," he almost smiled. Different from the almost smile yesterday. Yesterday's had been dismissive. This one was something more like rueful, self-aware. The expression of someone who is just beginning to understand the distance between who they've been and who they might become. That was something, that was actually quite a lot. "Where will you go?" Ada said. "Don't know yet," Rex said. "Thought I'd ask if there was any work around here. Real work. Not." He gestured vaguely at himself and the 2 guns he was still wearing, which suddenly looked slightly absurd against the backdrop of corn and morning light and porch coffee. Ada looked at him for a moment. "Henderson's ranch," she said. 2 miles east. Old man Henderson's been needing hands since his son left for California in the spring. "Tell him Ada Morgan sent you." Rex looked at her. "Why would you do that?" "Because you're here," Ada said simply. "That's enough." He sat with that for a moment. Then he nodded, finished his coffee, stood up, put his hat on not at an angle this time, just on. He walked out through the gate. Ada watched him go. Claire reappeared at the door. Who was that? Someone figuring something out, Ada said. Did he figure it out? He started to, Ada said. That's the important part. The letter came 4 days later, brought by a rider from the marshal's office, official, stamped, sealed with the specific authority of federal paper, which looked different from county paper in the way that things look different when they carry more weight behind them. Ada read it at the kitchen table. Then she read it again. Jerome had given full testimony. Walter Briggs, Walt, it turned out, had a last name, and it was Briggs, had corroborated testimony regarding the Elko incident, which connected Silas Crane to a pattern of conduct that the marshal's office was characterizing as, and Ada read the exact phrase carefully, a systematic campaign of coercion, intimidation, and conspired violence against landowners in mineral and adjacent counties. There was more, a lot more. Legal language that she read slowly and carefully, translating it from its official form into plain meaning. The plain meaning was, this was real. This was proceeding. This was not going to disappear. Beck Harrow had also provided a statement that surprised her more than anything else. He described in detail the circumstances of his hiring, the information Silas Crane had withheld, and his professional assessment of the situation as he'd found it. She didn't know what had moved him to go that far. Maybe professionalism, as she'd thought. Maybe something else. Maybe sitting across from a woman who didn't flinch to what she said had worked on him in some way she hadn't fully anticipated. She folded the letter, sat with it for a moment. The kitchen was quiet in the specific way of 10 in the morning, when Claire was at the Henderson place, learning to ride properly on their old quarter horse, and the farm was just the farm. Breathing in the late summer heat, Thomas. She thought about Thomas. He had documented land acquisitions. He had written letters to the county land office. He had been doing exactly what she'd described to Harrow. Looking at a pattern and trying to make it visible through legitimate channels, and it had cost him everything. This letter was, in some way, the end of what Thomas had started. Not in the way he'd meant to finish it, not through the channels he'd trusted, but finished. She pressed her hand flat on the folded letter. I tried, she thought, to Thomas. To wherever Thomas was. I think this is the part you'd have been glad about. She let that sit for a long time. Then she got up, put the letter in the box where she kept important documents. The land deed, Claire's birth record, the marriage certificate, a letter from Thomas's mother she'd never been able to throw away. The accumulation of a life's official proof that things had happened and people had existed. She added the marshal's letter. Then she went back to the field. Cal Denton came by that evening. He'd been coming by in the evenings. Not every evening. Not with a pattern so regular that it required explanation. Just frequently enough that Claire had started expecting it, which Ada knew because Claire had started setting 3 places at supper on the evenings she expected him without being asked. Ada had not commented on this. She was thinking about commenting on it. She hadn't decided yet. He came in through the gate the way he'd started doing. Not knocking at the front like a formal visitor, coming through the side gate and around to where Ada usually was, which was either the field or the back porch, depending on the hour. She was on the back porch this evening. The letter from the marshal's office was in the box. The corn was watered. Claire was inside with a book about horses that the Henderson girl had lent her. Cal sat on the step beside her. She told him about the letter. He listened the way he listened, completely, without interrupting, without rearranging his face to show her he was receiving it properly. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Federal investigation, he said. Yes, that takes time, I know, Silas will. I know, she said again. He'll lawyer up, he'll manage. He'll try to minimize. Some of it might work. She looked at the field in the fading light. But the record is made. Jerome's testimony is on paper. Walt's testimony. Harrow's. It can't be unmade, she paused. That's what Thomas didn't get to do. He saw the pattern, but he couldn't get it on record in a way that mattered. Now it's on record. Cal was quiet again. The evening light was coming in at the long amber angle that happened in August in Nevada, making everything look like it was either beginning or ending. Impossible to tell which. You're going to be all right, Cal said. not a prediction, not reassurance. More like an observation from someone who had been watching closely for a while and had arrived at a conclusion. Ada looked at him. "I know," she said. "Not the farm," he said. "I mean the farm, yes, but I mean you." He looked at his hands. "You were all right before any of this, before Harrow, before Jerome, before—" He stopped. Tried again. "You came through 2 years of things that would have broken most people. And you're sitting here talking about federal investigations, like you're discussing the irrigation schedule." Ada considered this. "I'm not as calm as I look," she said. "I know," he said. "I cry in the cornfield sometimes. I know that too." She looked at him sharply. "How do you know that?" "I don't," he said. "I guessed. Because you're human and you've had 2 years of a lot. And because the only place you go alone when things are hard is the field." He paused. "So I guessed you cry there, where no one can see. Because you don't want Claire to worry, and you don't want anyone else to think you're not managing." Ada looked at him. He looked back. "I cried in the stable after Margaret died," he said. "For about 3 weeks every morning. The horses didn't care. That was useful." Ada breathed in. Something shifted. Not dramatically. The way ground settles after rain. Everything slightly lower, slightly more stable, repositioned. "Cal," she said. Why do you keep coming by?" He looked at his hands, at the field, back at her. The specific look of a man who has been waiting for a question, and has the answer ready, but isn't sure about the delivery. "Because I want to," he said finally. "And because I spent 5 years not going places, I wanted to go. Because I didn't know how to want things after Margaret. And then I watched you sit across from 3 armed men and not flinch and say timing keeps you alive. Like it was the most obvious thing in the world." He paused. "And I thought, that woman has figured out something I haven't figured out yet. About how to keep living when the main reason you thought you'd be living is gone." Ada was quiet. The evening settled around them. Claire's voice came faintly through the wall. She was reading aloud to herself, the way she'd been doing lately, practicing the words. "She remembers things about him," Ada said. "Things I didn't know she'd kept." Cal was quiet for a moment. "That's a good thing," he said. "Yes," Ada said. "I think so too. She's going to be a lot," Ada said. "She has opinions about everything already. She'll have more when she's older. She's going to argue with you if you say something she disagrees with. She argued with me about the irrigation schedule last week. She's 7. Cal almost smiled. "I don't mind arguing." "You might," Ada said. "With her specifically, I'll risk it," he said. Ada looked at him. He looked back. "I'm not going to be easy," Ada said. "I've been doing this alone for 2 years. I have habits. I have ways of doing things. I count everything, and I sit with my back to the wall, and I cry in the cornfield, and I make decisions without asking anyone first, because asking anyone first stopped being an option." "I know," Cal said. "That doesn't bother you, Ada," he said. "I'm a man who rode 6 miles in the dark and then told himself he wasn't coming, and then sat on the road anyway." He looked at her. "I'm not looking for easy." The light was almost gone. As we're starting. The way they started here. 1, then 3, then suddenly all of them at once. More than a person could hold in their attention at one time. Thomas had loved this sky. She could love it too. She could love it and let someone sit beside her while she loved it, and those 2 things did not cancel each other out. She was figuring that out. But she was figuring it out. "Supper's almost ready," she said. "I know," Cal said. "Claire told me when I came through the gate. She said if I was staying there was cornbread." Ada looked at him. "She told you." She was very matter-of-fact about it. Ada shook her head slowly. Looked at the stars, at the field, at the man sitting on her porch step who had ridden 6 miles in the dark because he hadn't wanted her to be alone out there, and couldn't fully explain that to himself, so he'd just gone. "Come inside then," she said. She stood up. He stood up beside her. They went in. 3 days after the marshal's letter, the Silas Crane came to Red Rock, not to Ada's farm, not in the middle of the night. He came to Cal Denton's office in the middle of the morning on a Thursday, accompanied by a man Ada didn't recognize, but Cal did, a lawyer from Carson City. Expensive suit, the careful face of someone paid to be present at difficult conversations. Cal sent for Ada. She came in from the Henderson property, where she'd been discussing the winter lease on their south pasture. She'd been there when the message arrived with the Henderson boy, and she'd come to town on Slate at a pace that was not quite hurrying and not quite not hurrying. She arrived at Cal's office, tied Slate at the post, went inside. Silas Crane was sitting across from Cal's desk. The lawyer was beside him. Cal was behind his desk with the specific posture he had when he was being the sheriff. Upright, steady, not hostile but not warm. He looked at Ada when she came in. Silas looked at Ada when she came in. Ada looked at both of them. "Mrs. Morgan," Silas said. "Mr. Crane," she said. She pulled the remaining chair to a position that suited her, not across from Silas, not beside him, but at an angle that let her see both him and the lawyer clearly. She sat, back straight, hands in her lap. "This is unexpected." "Probably not entirely," Silas said. He looked different than he had in his parlor. The parlor version of Silas Crane had been caught off balance, a man in his own space, confronted with something that had moved faster than he'd prepared for. This version was composed, prepared. He'd had 3 days and a lawyer and whatever internal machinery he ran to produce the Silas Crane who sat in public and appeared reasonable. But his hands, folded on his knee, Ada looked at them. The control was in his face. His hands were still carrying what his face had decided not to show. "The federal investigation," Silas said, "is proceeding." "Yes," Ada said. "My attorney has reviewed the testimony provided. Jerome's statement. The other statements." He paused. "They're significant." "Yes," Ada said. "What you said to me the other night," Silas said slowly. "About cost. About arithmetic." He looked at his folded hands. "I've been thinking about that." The office was quiet. Outside, Red Rock went about its Thursday morning. A wagon. Voices. The ordinary sounds of people doing ordinary things. "The arrangement my attorney has drafted," Silas said, "would include a formal acknowledgement of the Morgan Farm's boundaries, a recorded agreement that no member of the Crane family or any party acting on the Crane family's behalf will make claim, contest, or take any action regarding the Morgan property in perpetuity." He glanced at his lawyer. "A formal renunciation of any interest." Ada looked at the lawyer. The lawyer produced a document, set it on Cal's desk. Cal didn't touch it. He looked at Ada. Ada looked at the document, at Silas, at the document again. "The investigation continues," she said, "regardless of any private agreement." "I don't have authority over the marshal's office, I know that," Silas said. "I'm not asking you to stop it. What are you asking?" He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Cal's pen made a small sound against the desk. Long enough that Ada heard a wagon pass outside on the street. Long enough that she began to calculate what she would do if he stood up and walked out. He didn't stand up, but he looked at her with something she hadn't seen in his parlor that night. Not calculation, not management. Something older and more tired than either of those. "I've spent 20 years, he said quietly, "building something I thought would last." Ada said nothing. "It turns out," Silas said, "that things built on the wrong foundation don't last regardless of how much you put into them." He looked at the document. "That's not wisdom. It's just arithmetic. The kind that takes too long to arrive." He picked up Cal's pen. "I'm asking you to accept this," he said finally, "not as resolution. I understand there is no resolution. What happened to your husband? I'm not—" He stopped. "I am not able to give you that back. Nothing I do or don't do gives you that back." Ada looked at him. "Grant was my brother," Silas said. He didn't always do what I intended him to do. I told myself that meant the gap between my intentions, and what happened was someone else's responsibility." He looked at the floor. "I've been rethinking that." Ada was very still. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Silas said. "I'm not that optimistic." "Good," Ada said. "I'm not in a position to offer it, I know." "Silence. Sign the document," Ada said finally. "In front of Cal. He'll notarize it and file it." She looked at Silas steadily. "And understand that the federal investigation is beyond both of us now. What Jerome told the marshal, that runs its course." Silas nodded. "Do you understand that?" Ada said. Not aggressive, just direct. Because she needed to know he understood it in the full weight of it, not just the convenient part. "I understand it," Silas said. Cal slid the document to Silas. Silas signed it. Cal witnessed it. The lawyer took it and made his notations and produced his stamp, and the whole formal machinery of documented agreement completed itself in about 4 minutes. Then Silas stood, looked at Ada. "Your husband," he said. "I read his letters. to the county land office. His documentation, he paused. He was thorough. Ada said nothing. He was right about the pattern, Silas said. I want you to know someone said that to you. He saw it clearly. He put his hat on. That should have mattered more than it did. He walked out. The lawyer followed. The door closed. Cal and Ada sat in his office in the specific silence that comes after something has ended. Not cleanly, not in a way that resolved everything, but in a way that marked a definite before and after. Thomas was thorough, Cal said quietly. He was, Ada said. He would have. I wish I'd known him better. Ada looked at the desk where the document had been signed, already filed, already recorded, already part of the permanent paper record of what had happened here. He would have liked you, she said. He liked careful people. Cal looked at her. She looked back. Come for supper Friday, she said. Claire's been making plans about the cornbread, and I don't want to be responsible for disappointing her. Cal's expression did the thing it did sometimes. The almost smile that was more genuine than a full smile would have been. Friday, he said. Ada stood, put her hat on, walked out of Cal's office into the full Thursday morning of Red Rock, Nevada, where the ordinary machinery of ordinary life was proceeding without particular awareness of what had just happened inside. Slate was at the post, ears forward, watching Ada come down the steps the way she always watched, with the specific attention of a creature that has decided this particular person is worth paying attention to. Ada put her hand on Slate's neck. All right, she said quietly, to the horse, to herself, to whoever was listening if anyone was. All right? February came to the Harney Valley the way February always came, cold that was serious about itself. Frost on the corn stubble. The crop was in, had been in since October, had been a better harvest than Ada had projected in August. Enough to clear the account at the bank, and put away a reserve for spring seed, and have a small amount left over that Ada had put in the box with the other important papers, wrapped in cloth, documented in the ledger Thomas had kept and she'd continued. The ledger was mostly her handwriting now. There were still pages in Thomas's hand toward the front. She left them. They were part of the record. She was adding to the record. Claire was 8 now, had been 8 since November. A birthday that had been marked with a cake Ada had made from a recipe Margaret Denton had written down, and Cal had brought over on a folded piece of paper, with a slight apology that he'd tried to make it himself, and then realized the problem wasn't following a recipe. The problem was something more fundamental about his relationship with baking. The cake Ada made from Margaret's recipe had been good. She thought about that sometimes. Margaret's recipe in Ada's hands in Ada's kitchen while Cal sat at Thomas's table, and Claire blew out her candles with the total commitment of an 8-year-old who believes deeply in the power of birthday wishes. Life built itself out of odd materials. You didn't plan it that way. You just kept going, and kept going. And the thing you were building while you kept going turned out, eventually, to look like something. The federal case against Silas Crane had proceeded through the fall and into the winter, with the specific grinding patience of federal process. Ada had given testimony in October. She'd ridden to Carson City with Cal and Jerome and spent 2 days in a federal office answering questions from men who had the careful, skeptical faces of people paid to not believe things until they were proven 6 times. She'd answered every question directly. Jerome had answered every question directly. Walt Briggs. She'd gotten a letter from Walt in December, which had surprised her, then unsurprised her. Because Walt had seemed like a man who would eventually write a letter, had appeared and given his Elko testimony and then gone back to Provo. His letter said he'd found work, real work, something with horses. The letter was short and slightly awkward, in the way of someone who doesn't write letters often, but felt that this particular letter needed to be written. She'd written back Beck Harrow she hadn't heard from. She didn't expect to. Harrow was professional about things, including, she imagined, the management of which parts of his past he kept contact with. Silas Crane had not sent anyone else. The recorded agreement sat in the county records. The federal investigation sat in the federal process. Both of those things were real and ongoing, and she didn't have control over either of them, and had made peace with that. What she had control over was the field, the account. Claire's education. She'd arranged for Claire to study with the school teacher in town 3 days a week, and Claire had opinions about everything she was learning, and shared them freely, and Ada spent those evenings both exhausted and quietly amazed at the specific person her daughter was becoming. What she had control over was this life. She was controlling it. Cole came by on a Thursday in February, with the cold pressed into his coat, and his hat pulled down, and the look of a man who had been intending to say something for a while, and had finally decided to say it. Claire was at the Henderson place. Ada was at the kitchen table with the ledger open, and a cup of coffee she'd been meaning to refill for the past hour. Cal sat across from her. She looked at him. He looked at the ledger, at his hands, at the cup of coffee she'd forgotten about. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "You get a line. Right here." She touched her own forehead. He looked at her. "That's what Claire says about me," Ada said. "I know," Cal said. "She told me. She tells you a lot of things." "She does," he said. "She told me last week that she thought it was taking a long time." He paused. "She didn't specify what. She seemed to assume I'd know." Ada looked at the ledger, at the cup of coffee, at Cal. "She's 8," Ada said. "She's very direct for 8. She gets it honestly," Ada said. A pause. "Ada." Cal said. "I know," she said. "You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to say something about." She stopped. Tried again. "About whether this." She stopped again. "I'm not good at this part," she said. "Neither am I," he said. "I haven't been good at this part in 5 years. I've been practicing in my head for about 3 months, and I'm still not sure I've got it." Ada looked at him. Cal Denton, 44 years old, sitting at Thomas Morgan's kitchen table in February, slightly red around the ears, in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, holding his hat in his hands with the same careful rotation he gave, everything he was being careful with. "Claire needs stability," Ada said. "She's had a lot of uncertainty. 2 years of things she was too young to fully understand and old enough to feel the shape of. I won't introduce something that—" "I know," Cal said. "And I'm not easy," Ada said. "I told you that before. I make decisions without consulting people. I count things. I sit with my back to the wall. I have a farm and a daughter, and a box of important papers and a cornfield, and I'm not a project." "I don't need Ada," Cal said. She stopped. "I know," he said simply. "I'm not here because you need something. I'm here because He stopped. Something crossed his face. Complicated, honest. The expression of a man not managing his face for once. "I want to be here. That's all. I want to be here." The kitchen was quiet. The cold pressed at the windows. Ada looked at him for a long moment. "Thomas," she said. Not as a barrier, as acknowledgement, as the true thing she needed to say. "I know," Cal said. "I don't want to be Thomas. I couldn't be. I don't think you'd want me to try." He looked at his hands. "I want to be whatever there's room for. I'll start with that and see." Ada breathed in, breathed out, thought about Thomas. Not with grief, not with guilt, not with the ache of his absence. With love. Straightforward, past tense permanent love for a man who had been good and had not deserved what happened to him, and who had, she believed, wanted her to keep going. Had always wanted her to keep going. Had said so, actually, in a way she hadn't understood was significant at the time. "Ada, you're the one who keeps going. Whatever happens, you're the one who keeps going." She'd thought he was talking about the farm. She understood now he'd been talking about everything. "Friday," she said. Cal looked at her. "I'm already coming Friday, I know," she said. "I'm saying yes, Cal. I'm saying it in the only way I know how, which is apparently through references to the dinner schedule." He looked at her. She looked back. And then something happened in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not the almost smile, not the careful expression of the sheriff, not the quiet watchfulness of a man managing his own grief. Something more open than any of those. Something that looked like arriving. The specific look of a person who has been traveling towards something for a long time and has just caught sight of it clearly enough to know they're going to make it. "Friday," he said. "Friday," she said. She got up to refill her coffee. He stayed at the table, and in the specific ordinary way of things that matter the most, nothing dramatic happened at all. Just a woman making coffee in a kitchen in February, while the man at her table let out a breath he'd been holding for longer than either of them would probably ever calculate. 6 months after that, August again, the particular circularity of farms. You came back to the same tasks, the same field, the same hour before dawn, the same silver light on the same corn in the same Nevada heat. But you came back as someone slightly different than you'd been the last time. The calendar repeated. The person didn't. Ada was in the field at 5:30. Always would be. Probably the corn needed it, and she needed it. The two needs had merged somewhere along the way into something that didn't require distinction. She watered the corn at 5:30 because it was what she did, because she was a farmer, because this field was hers, and its needs were hers, and meeting those needs was the most direct expression available to her of the fact that she was still here and still going. The sky was doing its thing. Silver, then gold, then morning. From the house sounds. Claire getting up. She was 9 now, and had recently decided she was old enough to get up when her mother got up, a decision Ada had not fought because Claire was probably right. The sound of the kitchen pump, the particular sound of Claire making coffee, which she'd been learning, and which still produced results that were ambitious. Another sound. Boots on the porch. Ada didn't turn around. She knew those boots. Cal came across the yard and into the field and stopped beside her. He'd been staying at the farm most nights for the past 3 months. Not the way it would need to be formalized eventually. They'd talked about eventually. But for now it was what it was, and what it was good. He stood beside her in the field. Didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They stood in the early morning in the corn and let the light come up the way it always came up, indifferent and enormous and beautiful anyway. Claire appeared at the field's edge. Her hair was not in its braid yet. She was holding 2 cups of coffee with the concentration of someone managing a technical challenge. She made it across the grass without spilling and handed 1 cup to Ada and 1 to Cal with the efficient manner of a person who considers this a reasonable morning task. I made it stronger this time, she said. Ada tasted it. She kept her expression neutral. It's strong, she confirmed. Cal tasted it. Kept his expression neutral. Very strong, he said. Good strong. Claire looked satisfied. Went back to the house to get her own. Ada looked at Cal. Cal looked at Ada. Something passed between them. The shared expression of 2 people who are both pretending a 9-year-old's coffee is drinkable and who find this funny in a way that is not actually about the coffee at all. Ada looked back at her field. The corn was good this year. Better than last. She'd adjusted the irrigation in March, and it had paid off through the summer heat. The rows were straight and full, and the ears would be heavy, and she knew this the way she knew it. From looking, from reading, from 10 years of learning this specific piece of ground. Thomas had known it too. It was still his field in that way. In the knowledge she carried about it that had come from him, from farming it beside him, from the language of this particular land that she'd learned to speak through him, and now spoke alone, and soon would teach to Claire, who was already starting to learn it, who knew which rows got the most afternoon sun, and which corner held water longest, and which stalks to watch for signs of stress. The knowledge passed on, the living continued, the field kept growing. Around her, Nevada in August did what it always did, pressed down with its heat and its enormous sky and its uncompromising beauty, and demanded nothing from her except that she show up. She showed up. She always showed up. That was the thing about this land. It didn't ask why. It didn't ask about your grief or your history, or whether you had good reasons for being there. It just asked whether you were there, whether you were paying attention, whether you were willing to put in the work that the work required. Ada was willing, had always been willing, was more willing now, somehow, than she'd been 2 years ago. Not because things were easier, though some things were easier, because she understood better what she was willing for. Not just survival, not just keeping the farm going, keeping Claire fed and safe and educated, keeping the account at the bank from going to zero, living the actual living. The 5:30 mornings and the corn that smelled like something clean when the irrigation ran over it in the heat. The specific satisfaction of a harvest that came in better than projected. Claire's opinions about everything. Cal's coffee cup rotation. The ledger with Thomas's handwriting at the front and hers filling the rest. The West does not forgive slowness. She'd thought about that a lot, about what it meant, about whether it was true. She'd decided it was true but incomplete. The West didn't forgive slowness. That was real. If you were slow to read a situation, slow to act, slow to understand what was actually in front of you, this land and the people on it would take that from you without ceremony. But the West also had no patience for people who confused moving fast with going somewhere, who confused being loud with being right, who confused being strong with being unwilling to stop. 3 men had walked into Ruth's saloon one August morning. 2 of them had understood what they were looking at too late. One of them was driving a wagon for Henderson's ranch now, and had been known to sit on the porch in the evenings and look at the Red Rock Hills with the expression of someone who is learning to be somewhere. The West required that you be somewhere. Really be there, paying attention, reading what was in front of you instead of what you'd assumed would be there. Adjusting, surviving wasn't enough, but it was a start. Ada drank Claire's strong coffee and stood in her field in the morning light and was here, present, real. A farmer in Nevada in August in 1880, with corn that would be ready in October, and a daughter who had her father's eyes, and a man who had ridden 6 miles in the dark because he didn't want her to be alone out there. Enough, more than enough. The kind of life that didn't announce itself as remarkable. The kind that just was, day after day, morning after morning, the small and stubborn and beautiful accumulation of a person who had kept going. She walked the next row, read the plants, kept going. Narrators closing. I've been telling stories from this part of the country for a long time now. I've told stories about men who were fast, men who were slow, men who made good decisions under pressure, and men who didn't. Men who chose mercy when they didn't have to, and men who chose otherwise when they should have known better. This one is different. This one is about a woman at a corner table who already knew how the day was going to go before it went there, who sat with her back to the wall, not because she was afraid, but because information is power, and the more of it you have, the better your decisions are. Ada Morgan didn't win because she was the fastest. She wasn't the fastest. She won because she was the most prepared. Because she'd spent 2 years doing her grieving and her fearing, and her counting and her watching, and when the morning came that required everything she had it available. That's not a gunfighter's skill. That's a human skill. The one that keeps people alive long after the fast ones are done being fast. The West does not forgive slowness. Ada Morgan knew that. She'd known it since before any of this started. But she'd also learned something the posters don't mention. Knowing where you're going is worth more than how fast you get there. 3 men walked into a saloon one August morning. Only one of them understood that before the day was over. The other 2 are still learning it, in their own ways, at their own pace, which is, maybe, the only way any of us ever learn anything worth keeping.